Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the absolute most misunderstood eras in all of history, the Romantic period, running roughly from 1780 to 1832. Now, I want you to completely forget that stereotype of quiet poets just wandering through fields of daffodils, okay? Because this literature, it was actually a desperate, urgent response to a world that was violently transforming right before their eyes.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really understand the shock of this era, picture England in 1771. It's essentially a pastoral nation, right? Defined by quiet farms and small, sleepy villages. But flash forward a mere 60 years to 1831, and boom, it is transformed into the world's very first industrialized urban power. We're talking skies choking with coal smoke and green fields being paved over at breakneck speed. In that exact same 60-year window, they lived through revolutions, the loss of empires, domestic massacres, and massive social reforms. It was literally an age of absolute storms, and the literature we now call Romanticism was written right in the eye of it.
So, to untangle this massive web of history, we're going to follow a mental roadmap of deeply interwoven threads. We'll cover 1. The timeline of upheaval, 2. The industrial and social shift, 3. A revolution in thought, 4. Politics, empire, and repression, 5. The fight against slavery, and finally, 6. The voice of a society.
Let's move to and see how this builds, starting with Section 1, the timeline of upheaval. History and literature collide.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer synchronicity of it all. Major political earthquakes and monumental literary landmarks consistently share the exact same years. Look at this. 1789, the Bastille falls in Paris, sparking the French Revolution. That very same year, William Blake drops Songs of Innocence. In 1798, you've got Britain battling Napoleon's navy at the Nile, while Wordsworth and Coleridge quietly published lyrical ballads, basically launching English Romantic poetry. 1807, the British slave trade is abolished, which is the exact same year Lord Byron debuts. Move to 1815, that brings Waterloo and the deeply unpopular Corn Laws. 1819 gives us the sheer tragedy of the Peterloo Massacre, where cavalry charged a peaceful crowd, and simultaneously, Byron starts his masterpiece, Don John. Finally, 1832 sees the Great Reform Act passed, just as Alfred Tennyson makes his debut. The main takeaway here? Romantic literature was written inside history, not apart from it.
So keeping that in mind, let's look at the literal ground shifting beneath these writers' feet in Section 2, the industrial and social shift, from fields to factories.
And this brilliantly illustrates the scale of the change. 13 million. Between 1771 and 1831, England's population basically doubled, skyrocketing from 6.4 million to 13 million people. I mean, just try to imagine the sheer panic of urban planning for that kind of infrastructure shock. It's wild. Tiny villages instantly swelled into massively overcrowded factory towns almost overnight. The tragic result was tenements totally lacking basic sanitation, rampant disease, and just grinding poverty for a massive, brand new urban working class.
But it wasn't just the cities. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, Parliament passed over 2,500 enclosure acts between 1762 and 1844. What did that actually mean? Well, common land, stuff that ordinary rural families had relied on for generations to graze animals and grow a bit of food, was suddenly fenced off and turned into privately owned fields. Naturally, this made wealthy landowners even richer by driving up agricultural yields, but it completely and utterly devastated smallholders and the rural poor. The unrest was so intense it led to literal protests like rick burning, the deliberate torching of grain stores. People were desperate.
So the crucial point is that out of this massive physical disruption emerged a distinctly modern class consciousness. The old medieval system, the one based on inherited birth and rank, was violently shoved aside. In its place, a new order of landlords, capitalists, and industrial laborers working in incredibly dangerous factories. That means when we read Romantic poets writing so beautifully about solitary shepherds or abandoned mothers, they weren't just painting pretty, quaint pastoral pictures. They were actively documenting a rural way of life that is being completely destroyed right in front of their eyes.
Now that we've seen the physical world change, let's shift our focus to the human mind. Section 3, a revolution in thought, philosophy, science, and faith. And this brilliantly illustrates a massive philosophical pivot that changed everything. For most of the 18th century, John Locke's empiricism really ruled the day. He treated the human mind as a passive, blank slate, just sort of sitting there receiving impressions from the outside world.
But then along comes Immanuel Kant, and he introduces total philosophical whiplash. With his transcendental idealism, Kant argued the exact opposite. He said no, the mind isn't passive at all. It actively shapes and creates the reality it perceives, particularly through the imagination. This one pivot from a totally passive mind to a fiercely active, creative one was the absolute seed for Romantic literature. It directly powered Coleridge's famous theories on how our creative minds transform raw perception into high art. Alongside philosophy, science was going through its own radical splintering. What used to be just natural philosophy was breaking apart into these distinct, highly specialized disciplines that we recognize today. You had guys like Volta and Davy unlocking the unseen, honestly almost magical secrets of electrochemistry. You had geologist James Hutton blowing minds by proposing the concept of deep time, basically arguing the Earth was vastly, unfathomably older than anyone thought. And get this, decades before Charles Darwin published his famous origin theory, his own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, along with Lamarck, were already tossing around early theories of evolution. Science was wildly, rapidly expanding outward. But, and here's the fascinating contrast, at the exact same time science was pushing outward, a massive religious revival was pushing fiercely inward. Movements like Methodism and evangelicalism were just sweeping across Britain. They prioritized deeply personal salvation, intense emotional faith over pure cold reason, and super strict moral reform. So if you picture the Romantic mind, it's caught right in the middle of these intense crosscurrents. A philosophy insisting the mind creates reality, science uncovering deep time and invisible electricity, and a religious movement demanding passionate emotional faith. It's a lot to process.
Okay, let's dive into this next part because it gets incredibly tense. Section 4. Politics, Empire, and Repression. Literature in a Dangerous Age.
See, the British government was actually initially thrilled by the promise of liberty during the 1789 French Revolution. But as that revolution descended into terror and extreme violence, a profound, very real fear gripped Britain. In response, the government enacted a harsh conservative backlash to essentially crush any domestic political dissent. Prime Minister William Pitt suspended habeas corpus, which literally strips away the basic right not to be imprisoned without a trial. They held the 1794 treason trials against radicals, passed the repressive 2 Acts of 1795, and later the 6 Acts of 1819, right after the trauma of the Peterloo Massacre. Writing and publishing radical ideas during this specific time, it wasn't just edgy, it was quite literally dangerous.
Meanwhile, having recently lost its American colonies, Britain's imperial ambitions pushed much further into Asia. And Romantic writers responded to this rapidly expanding empire in some strikingly different ways. Writers like Coleridge and Shelley often viewed the East as this space of imaginative renewal and exotic wonder, but others, like Southey and Byron, often projected distinct Eurocentric anxieties and assumptions of imperial dominance onto that exact same region. Either way you look at it, the expanding, unfamiliar world far beyond Britain's shores heavily influenced the Romantic imagination.
Let's move to and see how this builds into one of the era's most morally urgent threads. Section 5, the fight against slavery, literature as a moral weapon.
The abolitionist campaigners at this time were absolute masters at building massive public pressure. And how exactly did they do it? Through highly organized, strategic tactics. First off, they published vast amounts of anti-slavery literature and first-hand testimonies. Second, they organized these massive nationwide public petitions. And third, they led incredibly effective consumer boycotts against slave-produced sugar. By combining these efforts, they successfully built the intense, undeniable public pressure required to pass the Act for the Abolition of the Slave Trade in 1807.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that literature genuinely gave the abolition movement its conscience. And remarkably, some of its absolute most powerful writing didn't come from the traditional canonical poets we always hear about, but from formerly enslaved authors themselves. In 1789, Olaudah Akiano published The Interesting Narrative. This first-hand account exposed the brutal, horrific realities of bondage, and it directly, intellectually challenged the racial ideologies being used to defend it. It serves as a vital, powerful reminder that some of the period's most urgent writing came from people fighting very real, present injustices on the ground.
Let's bring all these incredible threads back together for our conclusion. Section 6, the voice of a society, putting the pieces together. So the crucial point is this. When we step back and look at the big picture, the Romantic period was defined by 5 massive, overlapping upheavals happening entirely simultaneously. You have a rapid social and industrial revolution that doubled the population and enclosed the countryside. You have an intellectual revolution, placing the active, imaginative mind right at the center of reality. You have severe political crises swinging wildly from revolutionary hope to state repression. You have rapid imperial expansion. And you have a profound moral reckoning over slavery. All 5 of these forces combined to forge the unique Romantic consciousness.
Understanding this backdrop absolutely doesn't diminish the famous poetry of the era. If anything, it sharpens it. We can finally see that the famous Romantic obsessions, nature, childhood, the solitary individual, they simply do not exist in a vacuum. Every single time a poet praises a quiet walk through nature, it is a direct response to a landscape actively being fenced off and destroyed by industry. Every cry for the power of imagination is an answer to a world becoming increasingly mechanized and policed.
The Romantic period wasn't just some pretty literary style. It was the raw voice of an entire society in the middle of being violently and rapidly remade. Which leaves us with a really fascinating final thought. As we look at our own modern era, an era filled with rapid technological disruptions, massive global shifts, and intense social changes, what kind of literature are our own upheavals creating right now? Thank you so much for exploring this incredible era with me today on This Explainer. Keep learning and always keep looking at the history behind the art.